Hi and welcome to the Histories Inc. podcast. I'm Mallory Nye and this is episode 9. Today I'm going to discuss a fundamental starting point in our understanding of the discovery and settlement of America by Europeans. That is, the encounter with the indigenous people of the lands the Europeans and their descendants went on to colonise. Historically, this has come to be thought of as being based on the doctrine of discovery, an idea with significantly Christian religious underpinnings. In fact, this topic has turned out to be a lengthy one, as I found with some of the introductory episodes before, and so there are 2 episodes making up this discussion, this current one, episode 9, and then straight on to episode 10. In the first 8 podcasts of this series, I've been taking some time to introduce the various streams and themes that I'll be exploring as we make our way around the fluid prejudice of Histories Inc. If you haven't done so already, I'd recommend that you tune into these introductions, firstly to my discussions of the preliminary issues of Empire and Europeans' encounters, then the European Reformations, third, the indelible stain of slavery, and finally the history of Scotland. As I've stressed in these introductions, we'll find each of these themes interacting as we explore the topics of the podcast. So today, I want to start somewhere near the beginning of European encounters with and colonisation of people of the continent of America, stemming from the very early days of the Spanish discovery of the islands and landmass of what came to be known as America. Of course, this wasn't an empty place. The islands and the continent had been settled for thousands of years by many different nations and peoples. In this respect, European expansion into America was no different from their expansion into the African continent, as the Portuguese in particular explored their way down the African coast to find a route to the Indian Ocean, and then the subsequent expansions into the subcontinent of India and onward to the peninsular and islands of Southeast Asia, East Asia, and finally Australasia. In all these places, they didn't simply enter empty lands to freshly inhabit. They had to first encounter, negotiate with, and then find a way to live with the inhabitants of these lands. In most cases, this eventually involved ruling over the existing populations. What happened in America, however, was different from Asia and Africa, largely because the Europeans were successful in significantly dislodging the indigenous nations. We only have to think about the modern-day entities that have emerged from this process. While much of Africa and Asia has remained controlled in these post-colonial times by native populations, most of America is predominantly Europeanized. The only other places that are comparable are Australia, New Zealand, and historic apartheid South Africa. There are various reasons attributed to this success by European colonialists. It's well known that the diseases that the Europeans brought with them to America had a terrible impact on the native populations, since the latter had not acquired immunities to illnesses such as smallpox, whooping cough, measles, and scarlet fever. There were also technological differences, particularly technologies of violence, such as the use of gunpowder and firearms. Once the Europeans had established themselves in America and began to develop not only the land they acquired and its resources, but also the trade routes to and from this new world, they quickly built up both economical and political strength, which they then put to use to further control and dominate the indigenous nations. In particular, the story of Europeanized America, that is, America after the arrival of Christopher Columbus, is largely a story of colonization and colonialism, developing to the extent that it has become naturalized and is now largely invisible. Whereas European colonialism in most of Asia and Africa formally ended in the 20th century with decolonization and independence for indigenous communities, in America it hasn't ended. Indeed, the colonized indigenous populations have been largely silenced through death, displacement, and disempowerment. There is an ongoing trail through history from 1492 to the present day that has not been disrupted. Even the basic tenets and justifications for the process have remained largely intact. The power that is latent within this simple acknowledgement has been highlighted by a recent debate, or some would say controversy, in the Australian media. The University of New South Wales produced a guide for its students on the use of appropriate language in discussing the history of Australia, particularly since the time of the arrival of British Europeans in the 18th century. In particular, these guidelines recommended that students should think about the arrival of the British in Australia as an invasion rather than as a discovery. Thus, to quote the guide, Australia wasn't settled peacefully. It was invaded, occupied and colonised. Describing the arrival of the Europeans as a settlement attempts to view Australian history from the shores of England rather than the shores of Australia. The use of the word settlement ignores the reality of Indigenous Australian people's lands being stolen from them on the basis of the legal fiction of terra nullius, and negates the resistance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The fact that most settlers didn't see themselves as invading the country is beside the point. The effects were the same for Indigenous Australian peoples. As this makes clear, there is a very significant gulf of meaning between calling the arrival of Europeans an invasion rather than a discovery. The latter is seemingly benign and acceptable, and seemingly neutral, whilst the former is hostile and would be considered illegitimate in other contexts. Much the same could be said in the context of European expansion in North America. Of course, we're familiar with the common discourse of Columbus's and Europe's discovery of America on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Much debate continues about whether Columbus was the first to do so, and in particular when and how Nordic Vikings, such as Eric the Red and Leif Erikson, discovered it several centuries before. There is also some debate about how and to what extent other travellers from Europe and Africa may have made Atlantic crossings before, including Arab Muslims and West African explorers. There is also a further, even more speculative discussion of whether the ancient Chinese might have crossed either the Pacific or Atlantic at some point, long before Columbus's journey. What all this misses out on, of course, is the simple issue of the diverse and long-established inhabitants of the continent before the start of the 16th century. The Europeans may have discovered that the continent they named as America was there, whereas before Columbus's journey they were apparently unaware of it. But they didn't discover the continent on behalf of anybody other than themselves, much as I may discover for myself a nice restaurant that many others have already visited. But my discovery of a new restaurant doesn't lead me to moving into the premise, taking it over and claiming it as mine. In the phrasing used already, the Spanish and other Europeans' discovery of the American continent led to several centuries of intense dispossession of lands by the people entering, that is, invading those lands, and against the people who were already there. Even though few Americans or Europeans give much thought to this process, its consequences are still around, and will continue to have implications for many centuries to come. One example of this can be found in the ongoing debates about the basic issues of how Europeans and their descendants have come to have ownership of the large majority of the land that they found in America. Looking back from the present day, this has been a long and complex process, much of it in the US unfolding during the 19th century, with the rapid expansion of the new country westward across the northern continent. But the basis of the claims made by the Europeans to the land of America were rooted in much earlier sources, in particular dating back to the 16th and 17th centuries. These were, in particular, two main sources. First, the claims or grants or proclamations made by British monarchs that largely assumed ownership of the new lands. And second, the religious Catholic Christian proclamations made by popes as religious justifications and explanations of the position and status of the indigenous people of America, documents often referred to as papal bulls. Both of these sources are referenced explicitly in relationship to land ownership in the contemporary US legal system. In particular, these sources are the basis of a landmark judgment made in the US Supreme Court in 1823 by Chief Justice John Marshall, which remains applicable in US law today. Looking at the first of these, the royal claiming and granting of land. When Europeans first became aware in the late 15th century of the potential opportunities of the land mass of America, it caused considerable excitement in many respects. Thus, the English King Henry VII, father of the more famous Henry VIII and founder of the Tudor dynasty, commissioned in 1496 a Venetian explorer called Giovanni Caboto, known in England as John Cabot, to explore the new continent, and in doing so to claim the lands for the English crown. On this commission, Cabot made 3 journeys across the North Atlantic and visited Newfoundland and possibly other areas down the eastern coast. In doing so, he is thought to be the first European in the modern era to have set foot on the American mainland. Columbus didn't do so until a year later, although he of course visited many of the Caribbean islands before that date. King Henry's Act of Commission thus established for the English the sovereignty of the English crown in the lands of America. Accordingly, later monarchs, including James I and VI and his son Charles I, both claimed the right to grant lands to the new colonies, and the companies that ran them, such as the Virginia Company and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In doing so, English colonies of settlers were established in the mid-Atlantic and New England coastal areas, mostly on land they appropriated from indigenous groups. Sometimes this appropriation was based on some form of material exchange, whilst very often it was simply an assumption that the native people were not using the land, so the newcomers would make use of it, and in doing so take ownership. As I'll discuss in a later episode, there were some individuals who recognised that the process wasn't such a simple one. In particular, the nonconformist and early Baptist religious thinker and preacher Roger Williams, who started the colony of Rhode Island. Not only did Williams question the right of the king, Charles, to grant the lands of the indigenous peoples, he also argued that any land used by the English in the new colonies should be properly exchanged with the people who were there already. His voice was a dissenting one in many respects. And so, I'm going to have a brief pause here. As I mentioned at the beginning, the topic for this episode requires some more time, and so I'll continue the discussion in the next episode, when I will talk more in depth about the religious underpinnings of the North American land issues. That is in particular the statements that make up the idea of the Doctrine of Discovery. So, if you want to hear the rest of the discussion, then please go straight on to listen to episode 10. I'll see you there.